Hi, it's Dr. Parikh. So, when I talk about good listening, what is good listening? Take time to think of examples of really good listening and really not good listening. These could be real examples from your life. It could also be things from TV. Think of really cringy shows like The Office. And also think of really good shows where people are really caring about each other and listening well. And try to think about when we think about kind of observing interactions, I'll often tell you to think as if you're watching a video recording or listening to an audio recording. And sometimes it's helpful to separate those out and do one at a time. So think about the body language, eye contact, facial expressions, and other nonverbals, movements, postures, positioning. So if somebody, leans back versus leans forward versus just kind of sits up. And also how people are in relation to each other. Are they leaning away from each other? Are they leaning toward each other? Are they mirroring each other, meaning they're taking on similar postures? Also think about audio. Think of the tone they're using, how fast they're talking, and remember that different people have different norms. My norm is a little slower because I'm from the Midwest. So compared to most people in New Jersey, I talk a little slowly. Friendly reminder, on YouTube you can change the speed of things. My voice, you can listen pretty easily at double time if you're really focused and use the subtitles. Also think about the volume, how loud someone is. Again, there are differences culturally and individually on that. So what's really loud for one person might not seem that loud to another person. I remember one time my mother-in-law came, I was upstairs in their house. She came home. There was a big to-do, and it was mostly in a language I don't understand very much of. And she left, and afterwards I asked, I don't know if we were even married yet, but I asked my husband, like, oh, like, what's wrong? What happened? Why was your mother so upset? And he's like, what? Oh, she just couldn't find her shoes. So we came from families with very different set points and norms. So think about volume, think about the content of what someone's saying, so the actual like facts and ideas they're sharing, but also think about the emotions, which maybe they may directly be naming, or you might have to kind of fill in the blanks and figure out what emotion they're talking about based on subtle cue words. Think about the minimal encourager, so the ah, oh. And it could also be repeating back like afraid, so repeating back keywords just to kind of encourage the person. And also notice the kinds of questions that people are asking. So again, think of really good exemplary listening. Think of the people who really make you feel heard. And then also think about the people who make you want to slap them because they're just not listening. So our ideals are, and again, these may be somewhat culturally bound, but our ideals are to have a calm and open presence, um, to clarify and summarize, to help take that person from having this tangled up mess to having, kind of knowing where things are and why they're there and what to do next. And we do that by sort of, when someone's upset, they might tell you a story out of order, and you might reflect it back to them like, okay, so first this happened, and then that, and then this, or kind of figuring out what goes in each piece. So we might be clarifying. We might also be summarizing to say, wow, you're really angry with that person. And that fits under naming emotions as well. Excuse me, the idea that you may help them identify what they're feeling. And that doesn't mean you sit down and say, gee, let's figure out what you're feeling. Is it sad? Is it angry? We'll talk more about how you can more naturally work it in and how really precision matters. You may use minimal encouragers. I just mentioned what those were. You may also use questions, but really, when you're listening, when you're really trying to be an active listener, your goal is to let the story unfold and to ask as few questions as possible. So you're going to avoid interrogating, the sense of like a ping pong match where you ask a question and they answer it, and you ask a question and they answer it. You're particularly going to avoid why questions or other things that may put the person on the defensive, that kind of demands you to answer for yourself. Instead, you want to use things like who, what, when, and how. Those are nice open-ended questions so it invites more than a yes or no. You want to avoid distractions, so put your phone away. If you need something in your hand, I often knit during meetings because otherwise my brain just goes out the window. It may be like, keeping a little desk toy, but you may also want to tell the person and say, like, is it too distracting if I do this? It really helps me listen, but if it's going to be distracting to you, I'll try really hard to listen without it. It may also mean choosing a time and place and saying, like, okay, I'm having a really hard time focusing right now because there's a lot going on. Can we find somewhere quieter to talk? And that can be really difficult. My dissertation focused on peer support for grieving college students. And one of the things, and I was focusing on residence halls, and one of the things they said was, like, I might not be able to find a quiet place to talk to them. Which is true, particularly that was at Purdue's campus, and, it was, those residence halls didn't have a lot of quiet little rooms you could sneak off to. You want to avoid blaming. You certainly want to avoid victim blaming, so saying, well, that probably wouldn't have happened if you'd done such and such. We talk a lot about avoiding victim blaming with things like sexual assault, but just in general, trying to not use blaming language and being sensitive to things that might imply that it's their fault or they deserved this outcome. But also, I like to tread lightly on blaming other people. For one, particularly if it's someone complaining about a romantic partner, you don't know what's going to happen in the future. So if you say, you know what, I never liked that person, here's all the things that annoy me about them, and you really pile on and trash talk that person, and then they patch things up, that's kind of now weird between you and the other person. In a lot of professional relationships, you want to you want to have that professionalism. I also always assume that if someone is really quick to trash talk someone else to me, they are likely just as willing to trash talk about me to someone else. So when someone I don't know very well starts trash talking, even if I'm the one complaining, it feels a little weird. The last one is saying, so what you should do is, giving really direct advice in most of the time is not terribly helpful. One of the common responses when you try to do that, and people often think they want advice, but when you try to give it to them, the problem is if it was an easy solution, most of the time they would have figured it out on their own already. So what tends to happen when you give advice is you get a series of yes buts. So yes, but I can't do it for that reason. Yeah, that would be great, but blah, 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 blah. And maybe over time the person will come back and say, that's actually more doable. I was just overwhelmed. But in general, it's better to support the person looking for their own answer rather than trying to give it to them. Now that may be different. When I'm working as an advisor and someone's asking me about classes, I need to give them at least a lot of detailed information. If not specific advice of you should do this, I need to tell them here are, the pros and cons of doing this thing. But most of the time, you want to avoid giving direct advice. I wonder if I meant this to be earlier in, I probably meant this to be the first slide. But take time to think about the great listeners and the terrible listeners in your life. And think about how many of these things they do. Think about how you can work to be more like them, and especially when they're at their best. So, the best listeners on their A game. How do you know that they're listening? Versus, on the other hand, the terrible listeners, how do you know that they're not listening? When do you know that someone's tuned out? And what do you do about it? If a relationship's very close, you can often just say, it feels like you're not really listening. What's going on? And that's a very kind of non-blaming. It's just observing what is happening. And usually the person picks up on, oh, that was kind of crappy of me. Or it may be a time that the person will notice, like, oh, you really need me to focus right now. All right. Thanks.